Will you grab me a highlighter again? Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you.
Hello, Professor.
How are you? How's everyone this week?
Doing all right so far. How about you?
I'm doing okay, thank you. I should have unmuted everyone when I said, how's everyone doing? Okay, are there any questions before I just start?
Yes, I have a quick question. I was looking at like the homework on Blackboard, and I know it said something about like the discussion boards and answering 6 of them. Is that what we do, or is it every week when you post one, we should do it?
I didn't catch all of the first part. You just,
The discussion boards, when you post on the discussion boards,
yes.
is that do every single one of them, or I know on Blackboard it says to do six of them throughout the
Over the course
semester.
of the semester, you should pick your 7. So
Okay.
yourself, you don't need to answer every one, but you should plan every week, every other week to comment and to comment on a classmate's comment. So it's not
Okay.
a question.
I was just curious because I did a few of them already, but then I checked the Blackboard and saw that it was 6 or 7.
Well, then you should be ahead of things. So, yeah. Good.
Hopefully.
Good. Good. Any other questions on this or in anything else? Okay, let me just see. Sorry, I'm noting who is checking in. So I think someone would, I'd appreciate it if you would sign on in alphabetical order. It would make my job easier. I know you're not here to make my job easier, but okay. Yes, okay. I think we may just be missing one person, which is actually quite good. Okay, good. So I thought what we do tonight or this evening is we will get back to Boston, but I wanted to talk a little bit about another place where things are happening, and that is North Carolina. And you just shut this down for a moment. And oops, that's not what I meant to do. Okay, here we go. So, North Carolina is at this time the fastest growing British colony in North America. Its population in 1750 or some 1740 was about 50,000. And most of that population lived along in the east, along Albemarle Sound, a huge body of water that goes into the interior, and it looks very much like Tidewater, Virginia. Has anyone been there? I should have asked that before I just stopped. Our last contestant has just checked in, which is good. I should ask, has anyone been to North Carolina before I just start talking about it? Viola, you have? And what?
Yeah, I've been into Charlotte.
Okay. So Charlotte's kind of in the western part of the state, or?
Yeah, it's pretty western.
Okay.
It's like western south almost.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Or is this like, I might as well be talking about things happening on the dark side of the moon? Any recommendations, Lila, if anyone's going to North Carolina, what they might want to do?
Charlotte. Sorry.
It's a little boring. It's kind of boring, but we were going there on our way to South Carolina, but you have to stop at Bojangles if you can. It's like a Chick-fil-A almost.
Bojangles? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the tip. Good, good. Okay, so North Carolina by 1770 is the 4th largest North American colony. The largest, anyone know what the largest was in 1770?
Virginia?
Yes, that's right. And second, anyone want to guess?
Massachusetts Bay?
I don't think so. I think it was Pennsylvania. And
I see that.
I'm going to say Massachusetts would have been 3rd and North Carolina is 4th. And so its population in 1740 was about 50,000, more than doubled in 10 years. By 1750, it's over 100,000. By 1760, it's almost 200,000. I'm sorry, by 1770, it's almost 200,000. And it's growing exponentially. Most of the growth is not happening on the in the Tidewater. Let me just work this so it's a slideshow. Most of the growth is happening in the western counties: Orange County, Rowan County, Cumberland County, Anson County. And these are people mainly immigrants coming from Pennsylvania, and their first stop is Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And then they are going into the interior and making their way down the Piedmont area into the back country, as it's called, of North Carolina and South Carolina. They move past Virginia. Virginia, remember, oldest colony, was already pretty well settled. So they're looking for available land, and they're finding it in North Carolina in this interior where there's not a whole lot going on. I don't think Bojangles had opened yet, and even then, as Lila said, it was kind of boring. But here they can find cheap land, and this is where they're going. So you have a lot of Scots-Irish, Germans, and Scottish Highlanders. 1745, there was a huge rebellion in Scotland, and so there's an exodus from Scotland into British North America. And these folks are the ones coming into this Western country and setting up shop. And the real political power, though, is still in the East, in these small counties had been settled for about 60 years, 70 years when Carolina was first opened up. And that area looks very much like the Virginia Tidewater. Tobacco plantations, making tobacco for export. These people coming into this frontier aren't going to become tobacco planters because tobacco really doesn't do very well out here. They're becoming small farmers, doing other things as a way of making a living. Now, political situation here is this. The governor, who is appointed by the crown, chooses all of the most important local officials. And the most important local officials were the justices of the peace. Just remember that at this time, there is no police force and no real bureaucracy. And you may think, boy, it sounds like kind of an ideal situation. No bureaucrats, no police. I wouldn't necessarily want to live without one of those. And these justices of the peace really function as judicial officers handling, petty disputes, which most disputes actually are. Anytime you have a problem, these are the people who are supposed to solve the problem. This is very much an English way of doing things. You have justices of the peace, you have magistrates, and so on. Now, the governor also appoints the sheriff, and the sheriff, a county official who oversees law enforcement in a county as well as other things. And the sheriffs also collect taxes. And taxes are levied by there is an assembly. We'll get to that in a bit. The governor also appoints the constables. That is, these are the local law enforcement officials, as well as people who have various commissions to do things. And if you have one of these jobs, you're a justice of the peace, you're a commissioner, you're a sheriff, you don't have a salary. You may think, boy, well, what's in it for me then? I know none of you thinks like that. You're offered a job and immediately think, what's in it for me? You don't have a salary, but you do get to charge fees for your services. And the great thing about being a local official in North Carolina in this period is no one has said what the fees should be. So it's really up to you. Someone comes to the justice of the peace because they want to get married. Well, you as the justice of the peace will tell them, usually after the ceremony, how much this is going to cost them. Someone buys a piece of property. You have to go register it with the local official. So you go to the justice of the peace. How can I register the fact that I bought this piece of property? Well, he'll tell you, and he'll also tell you how much you owe him for this piece of information. So tremendously lucrative for people who see this as a way of making a quick buck. Now, the governor, the governor between 1765 and 1771 is the same guy we'll be talking about, William Tryon. And Tryon writes to the Earl of Shelburne, who is the British Secretary of State for American Affairs, that the fees in North Carolina raise about 40,000 pounds every year. But the Treasury only gets about 45 pounds of that. So you charge the fee and then you pocket it. You might send in some to the coffers of the provincial government just so you don't, you show you're doing your job, but it's really up to you to determine how much you send in. So these offices are quite lucrative. And what would really be in your interest to do would be to buy one of these offices, that is, bribe someone to get appointed a justice of the peace in one of these places in North Carolina. You don't actually have to go there. We've already heard from Lila that it's really boring. But so you're not going to go there, but you'll have a deputy who goes there. Now, the deputy can charge whatever he wants and then send you some, and you'll probably do pretty well with this. Now, about 2/3 of the members of the assembly are also justices of the peace. So they make a lot by this whole arrangement, and they're not interested in changing it. And the counties along Albemarle Sound each have about 5 delegates in the assembly. The counties to the west, these 4 counties that are growing really fast, only have 2 representatives for each one. So think about that. These counties settled first. They said, okay, each of us needs 5 representatives in the assembly, but the counties out west only have 2. They had determined this apportionment back when there weren't that many people out west, but this is a good way of keeping power along the East Coast and not out west. And consequently, no one in the assembly has to bother much about what people out west think because they're outvoted in the assembly. The counties to the east tend to be merchants and or tidewater planters, and they're really tied in with this commercial world across the ocean. The ones out west really don't have much of a link with people on the East Coast. Their real connection is either with other folks like them who have come through Pennsylvania or with the backcountry of South Carolina. Much more in common with the backcountry of South Carolina than with the East Coast of North Carolina. You see this in a lot of states even today. That is, they're really disconnected areas and one has political power often and another doesn't. So in about 1765, a group of these folks out on the frontier of North Carolina decide they really should organize and prevent this kind of abuse that they're suffering at the hands of this whole system. So they publish what they call the Nutbush Address. And this calls for lowering taxes and also abolishing the fees, or at least having some code so we know what a fee is for something, and also abolishing the quit rent. So quit rent is a particularly English custom where you essentially pay a fee to live on the land that you've already bought. You have to pay a quit rent to someone else to secure it. And often what might happen, this is what would happen if, say, we were in England. You, as a landholder, unless you happen to be one of the aristocrats, will have to pay a quit rent to the lord whose initial domain this had been. And what happened in some of these colonies, this is an historical thing, back in the 1680s, the British Crown had tried to set up a new regime in Massachusetts, and one thing they did was apply quit rents. Okay, everyone here now has to pay a quit rent to the government of England. Wait a minute, we bought this land already. Well, that's too bad. You have to pay a quit rent. Similar things happen in other places. Actually, in the 1770s, New York is asserting its control. They're trying to assert its control over what becomes Vermont. And when the parliament says all of this actually belongs to New York immediately imposes quit rents on people in that area. It's a quick way of raising, I don't want to say this too loudly. Here, one of you may go report this to the legislature and we think, oh, that would be a good way to raise money. We'll just charge everyone a quit rent. Now, they also want to rein in a group they really see as odious, and those are lawyers. And in May, a group of surveyors come to this area in western North Carolina, where these folks are essentially squatters. They've come here, and they might have bought land from someone who was already there, but there's no one out saying, hey, you can't come here unless you buy this property. So they set up shop here, and now suddenly a surveyor comes and starts measuring all of this land because other folks, primarily investors on the eastern side of North Carolina, are claiming this land and they're having it surveyed so they can sell it. About 100 angry farmers drive this party of surveyors out of the area. Now, in August of 1766, the surveyors don't come back, but if you ever drive a surveyor away, be pretty certain the surveyor is going to come back eventually. Now, in August of 1766, the provincial government hasn't done anything to address the concerns of these folks out west. Why should they? Because the system's working really well for the people in the eastern part of the state. So someone in the western part of the state drafts yet another of these addresses, which he calls the Regulator. The Regulator number 1. He's planning to issue more of these regulations. And this calls for resistance to these attempts by the East to govern them, to lord things over them. And they call for a meeting to decide whether the freemen of this county labor under abuses of power or not. That is, they're open to the idea that maybe we don't labor under abuses of power. All we know is we have these fees imposed on us every time we do things. We have surveyors coming to divide up the land. And we have all of these other burdens imposed on us by these folks in the East. And this movement seems to be led by a guy named Herman Husband. And Husband had come to the area from Maryland. And he actually has been a devotee of George Whitefield. Whitefield was a minister, an Anglican minister, who had toured through the colonies in the 1740s and 50s and 60s. And he's not preaching politics. He's a minister of the Church of England, but he addresses huge gatherings of people to get them to come closer to God. So you find a lot of folks in this era and this area who have been converted by Whitefield with his really interesting theological ideas. This is a period called the Great Awakening. It's a massive religious revival which happens in the colonies. And one thing it does is establish communication networks among the colonies and a wave of revival. Anyway, the regulator number one calls for reforms in these various onerous fees. And I should tell you, most of the local officials decide to go along with it. They say, you have a good point. We're going to try to set what the fees are so you know ahead of time. And we'll have other ways of making sure you're not being overly burdened. One official has absolutely nothing to do with this kind of nonsense, and that is a guy named Edmund Fanning. And Fanning recently arrived in North Carolina from Long Island. He's actually from Long Island, gone to Yale, and then he comes to North Carolina because it seems like a place where an enterprising young man with a college degree can make a mark. And Fanning is, he sees the way to get ahead in North Carolina is to become an ally of the governor, which he does. And the governor appoints him a justice of the peace in Hillsborough, one of these places in the western part of the state. I should also tell you, according to my sources, Fanning had a bad moral reputation, but I don't want that to color what you think of him. So Fanning cultivated a gentleman coming here to North Carolina, and he really sees an opportunity to do well. He charges pretty exorbitant fees, doing really well in this thing, and he says when the regulators say, hey, we should rein things in, he says he's not going to have the shallow understanding of the mob pass judgment on what a guy educated at Yale is doing here. So he's someone who has irked a lot of folks in this area because you go to him for any small matter and it becomes a big matter that you have to pay for. Okay, here's another big story happening in North Carolina. It doesn't have a permanent capital. The legislature, the assembly, I should call it, would meet in different places, usually always on the eastern seaboard, but it would rotate among these different places from year to year. And periodically there is a call, well, why don't we have a permanent place to meet? And actually in the 1740s, actually 1750s, the governor got permission from Parliament, from the Privy Council, which oversees affairs in America. The Privy Council gave Governor Dobbs, I think it was, permission to build a permanent capital, but the Privy Council finds out he'd actually proposed building a permanent capital on land that he owned, which was going to make the price of the value of his land really skyrocket. That is, and so they vetoed that idea in 1758. Now, as you're probably aware, as I think I've told you several times, the real population of the state, of the province, is in the West. But of course, those with political power want the capital near them. So in 1767, the governor, this is Governor Tryon, starts to build a permanent capital at New Bern, which is on the eastern seaboard. It's actually along Albemarle Sound, and it's a pleasant enough place. And you were going to build a capital, you need money for it, so he levies a poll tax. Everyone in the state, in the province, has to pay to help build this permanent capital, which will be in the best interest of everyone. This is Governor Tryon, who wants to build a permanent capital at New Bern. And actually, if you're the governor, what's the first thing you're going to build if you're setting out to build a permanent capital?
The governor's mansion?
The governor's mansion, exactly. And that is what Governor Tryon is building. So everyone in North Carolina is paying a tax to build a governor's palace, I think it would have been called, so that the governor won't have to move around. You can see there are these outbuildings on either side, which would be where the assembly might meet. But of course, the big thing is this is going to be the seat of government. Now, this, of course, is going to irritate the majority of the people who don't live anywhere near New Bern. And someone says that no man in 40 of the most populous counties will ever see this famous house when it's built. We're paying to build it. We're never going to see it. And also, it does also means if we have any business with the provincial government, we're going to have to go a long distance because now we have this permanent seat of government on the eastern seaboard. By the way, the mansion itself burned in 1798, but it was rebuilt in the 1930s. It's quite elegant, I'm told. I've never actually been there myself. But you see, what you see here are local officials who are creating these really big local grievances. None of these grievances have anything to do with the British Crown. It's with these local officials who are getting rich at the expense of the people they're supposed to be serving. And this is really what's going to drive what happens in North Carolina, as the regulators are really outraged. You see a similar movement in the backcountry of South Carolina, where the backcountry doesn't have any schools or churches or courts, because all of these things in South Carolina have to be established by law. You can't just set up your own school or your own court. You have to have, the assembly in South Carolina meets in Charlestown, which is on the coast. And here the backcountry is the area that's really filling up. And another thing that happens is well, in South Carolina, there's actually one thing that happens when there aren't any courts or anything is people start stealing horses. There's a wave of horse thievery on the frontier in South Carolina. You may think, boy, there are no courts, no laws, only the good people will be doing things. I tell you, a lot of the bad people are going to take this as an opportunity to steal your horses or do other things. And the governor, when people in the West say, hey, help us out because of these horse thieves, the governor tries to get the militia to come out, but the militia from the eastern part of the state is not going to go to the western part of the state. So these are pretty big problems. And in South Carolina as well as North Carolina. And in 1768, the regulators in the west of North Carolina decide to form their own government. They are not going to be governed by this cabal in the east, in New Bern, sitting around this governor's palace and simply taxing them. So regulator number 4 gives a series of rules. And one is there can't be any taxes unless they're agreeable to the law. And you have to have revenues applied to special purposes, and no officer can be paid more than the law allows. These all sound like reasonable enough things. But if you've been getting by simply by extorting taxes from people, you're not going to want to change. So in April of 1768, the sheriff out in Hillsborough County seizes a mare from a farmer who hasn't paid his tax. So, this guy says, hey, I don't need to pay these taxes. And so he doesn't. However, the sheriff says you do have to pay your taxes. And since you haven't paid your taxes, I'm going to seize one of your horses, which he does. And what happens next, the sheriff takes the mare into Hillsborough and the regulators follow. Huge mob, the sheriff would have called it. You may call it the outraged citizenry. They tie up the sheriff, they release the mayor, and then they go to Edmund Fanning's house because he is such an obnoxious guy And just because they find him so obnoxious, they shoot up his house. He's not home, which is fortunate for him. And the governor sends out a proclamation ordering them to disperse. I thought I had the proclamation earlier. Yeah, here it is. This is another proclamation from the governor telling these people to knock off what they're doing. And then the eastern militia, the militia from the eastern part of the province, is sent out to the west to try to put down this rebellion. In May, this is about a month after the incident with the mayor, about 500 regulators in Orange County, another of these western counties, issue regulator number 11. And this one apologizes for disrespecting the king and also rebukes those people who shot up Fanning's house. They say that was a bad thing. However, we're really angry about corruption and arbitrary practices, and they present this petition to the governor. You know, we're really sorry about shooting up the house. That was a bad thing, but we're really angry. What would you do if you're the governor? You get these people coming with contrition to say, we're sorry about shooting up your friend's house, but we're really upset. What would you do if you're Governor Tryon and these regulators who are saying we don't want oppressive taxes, and some of them shot up the guy's house? No one was injured in this. I don't know, would you call this, by the way, a mostly peaceful protest? That's a question, I suppose, for another day. Fanning certainly would. And the governor rejects the petition and tells the various officials to stop charging outrageous fees. That is, he sees this problem here. And also he says, why don't we publish a list of what the fees are and punish anyone who is extorting more? And so they say, okay, we're going to start punishing people for extorting more from people. And among the first people indicted for extortion is Edmund Fanning, who was actually, as I've made it clear, he's actually, for example, here was one fee that the list price was 2 shillings 8 pence. Fanning said the fee was actually 6 shillings. So it's double. Whatever the fee was, Fanning is going to double it. And so he's charged with extortion. He is indicted. Now remember, he is still a justice of the peace. So what he does when he's indicted for extortion is he immediately has Herman Husband, the leader of the regulators, and 3 other people indicted for rebellion. Now with this, with Husband now being indicted, you know, the court is going to open and hear both the case of Fanning and the case of Husband and the other regulators. Something like 1,400 men march to Hillsborough onto the court. And then by the time the court opens, there's something like 3,700 of these guys in town. And Governor Tryon goes out to Hillsborough too. And the jury winds up acquitting Herman Husband, finds the other 3 regulators guilty of rebellion, and they are fined 50 pounds and 25 pounds, but however the governor releases them. And then Fanning is convicted of extortion, and he is fined the court costs plus a penny, and he resigns. Now, 1769 elections, and the regulators overwhelmingly win, particularly in the West. Fanning is voted out, but when he is voted out, the governor creates a special borough for him, so he can still be in the assembly from Hillsborough. I think he is the only one in his little borough. However, so he wins there in his little borough in Hillsborough. And then the assembly meets. Now at this time, this is after Parliament has passed a series of taxes on the American colonies. The assembly calls for a boycott of these goods, lead, paint, glass, and tea, and the governor suspends them. What you're going to have over the next year or two in North Carolina is this continuing tension between regulators, primarily in the West, and this government under Tryon. He leaves in 1771 to become the governor of New York, and his successor, and in fact, it comes to a head in 1771 when the governor calls out the militia because the regulators have pledged not to pay any taxes and to prevent the courts from sitting, and they threaten to kill judges and lawyers. They also declare Fanning to be an outlaw and say he can be killed on sight. Now, with this, the governor calls out the militia, and they march out to the west, and about 1,400 militiamen camp on Alamance Creek, which is near, I guess, the town of Burlington in North Carolina. And 2,000 regulators come to talk to the governor, who has these 1,400 militiamen with him. And the governor says, hey, I'm not going to talk to you until you put down your weapons. Yes, I'll give you an hour to put down your weapons. They don't. And the governor has the militia open fire on the regulators. And in the short battle that follows, 9 of the governor's troops are killed, another 60 are wounded, and of the regulators, 9 are killed, an unknown number are wounded, and then the regulators scatter. A number of them are apprehended. 12 of them are charged with treason and put on trial, and ultimately 6 of them are hanged. The governor pardons 6,000 of the regulators. Many of them flee west over the mountains into what becomes Tennessee, or north. Herman Husband goes up to Pennsylvania. And what we really see in North Carolina, I'm not meaning to belabor the case here, is these local grievances, which have nothing at all to do with the British Crown, really exacerbating this very local story and creating this schism in North Carolina, which does, however, bring up for these people the important notion of self-government. That is, who will govern us and who will control us? And they very much want a local control here. And what we'll see as we advance into the years of the Revolution, the war is really going to be its most violent here in North Carolina and in South Carolina, where you've had these long-standing grievances and disagreements among people that really blow up during the war. The war really gives an opportunity for people to take revenge on one another for things that had happened here in the 1760s, early 1770s. So you have this movement in North Carolina, the regulators trying to establish control in this area, and you have a provincial government which feels it controls this area. And that's really the big division here in the Carolinas. Are there any questions on this? I didn't mean to spend so much time on North Carolina, but okay. By the way, I was just reading today about the Battle of Alamance, and one of the local guides calls it the first battle of the American Revolution. I'm a little skeptical of that. And actually, I should tell you, the Congress of the United States designated the Battle of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the first battle of the American Revolution. And so I'm not going to disagree with Congress, but we'll talk more about this when we get to the Battle of Point Pleasant, which happened. Anyone know anything more about the Battle of Point Pleasant? I fear if you've been in one of my classes, I've gone off on a long tangent about it, and maybe I haven't. So you have that to look forward to. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Boston, because Boston is really where the revolution begins. And as I mentioned last time, let me see, I do have more to share with you. Okay. Yes, okay. So 1768, British troops arrive. And this is Paul Revere's engraving of the arrival of the British troops, which I know I talked about last time. And what you see are the church steeples in this town. And you see the warships in the harbor and the troops mustering on Long Wharf. And actually, one of my favorite things here is this gap. That's Andrew Oliver's warehouse. Remember that the mob tore down in 1765, and Revere puts it there. It's like the missing tooth. And It's a somewhat accurate depiction of Long Wharf at the time, but what you see really are the church steeples. This is the old State House. This is the first church. This is the North Church, Old Christ Church. This is the third meeting, the second meeting. No, this is the second meeting house, Cotton Mather's Church. All these churches, why do you need troops to keep the peace in a town like this? Because everyone is always praying. And of course, the troops find a much different situation. Last time I talked about the manufactory house. And you have, with the arrival of the troops, Boston really under siege. And one of the things that happens is the assembly sends a circular letter to the other colonies, calling on all of them to resist this encroachment. And the governor Governor Francis Bernard orders the assembly to rescind this letter. This is a big issue in 1768, rescinding the letter. And 92 members of the assembly vote against rescinding the letter. 17 agree with the governor that we should rescind it. According to the governor, and according to British policy, the assemblies didn't have any business communicating with each other. The governors would communicate with governors of other provinces, but if the Massachusetts Assembly wanted to communicate with another assembly, they would have to go through the Lords of Trade in England, or have an agent in England who then could communicate on their behalf. But they had no business communicating with each other. And these 17 rescinders agreed. And this is a political cartoon. Again, Paul Revere did this cartoon. Where are these 17 people who agreed with the governor going?
Is that hell?
Yeah, that's hell. They're being ushered into the jaws of hell by the devils. And you'll see one of the things that says is that they would be too much even for the devils. These puny villains, damned for petty sin, on such distinguished scoundrels, gaze and grin. So it's not just we disagree with the position these guys took on this particular piece of legislation. These are puny villains who are being ushered into the jaws of hell, a warm place in hell, reserved for these 17 guys who have said, yeah, let's rescind the letter because we don't want any trouble. Now, meanwhile, several members of the Sons of Liberty and other opponents provide 45 ounces of silver to Paul Revere, with which he crafts this bowl. It's a punch bowl. It's a punch bowl that weighs 45 ounces, and it's designed to hold 45 gills of rum. And around in the lip, you see the name of the people who paid for it. And then on the front and the back, let me see if I have more pictures of it. I know I do in one of my other really very interesting slideshows. Yeah, here we go. This is it. It has all of this other iconography on it. Like here you see number 45, Wilkes and Liberty. 45 is this cardinal number for them. You're going to, I'll show you more numbers 45. Actually, why don't we do this now? So this is the punch bowl. 45 Wilkes and Liberty. And then you see up here it says Magna Carta. And here it says Bill of Rights. Number 45, Wilkes and Liberty. Has anyone seen this bowl, by the way?
No, sir.
It still exists. It's in the Museum of Fine Arts. In fact, if you go into the American wing, this is the first thing you see. And it is sitting right in front. It's usually in front of the portrait of Paul Revere. I think the Revere portrait is on loan at the moment. So it's in front of the portrait of Samuel Adams. So this is an icon. And if you ever become a dignitary and you visit Boston because you don't live here, the mayor will present you with what's called a Revere Bowl. It's kind of a token of our esteem for people, the Revere Bowl. And this is the first one, made in 1768 at this moment to commemorate the valiant 92. Here you can see, in memory of the glorious 92 members of the Honorable House of Representatives. So, and it voted not to rescind. Imagine a piece of legislation. The people who voted on one side are going to hell. The glorious people who voted on the other side are going to be forever remembered with this punch bowl. And I should also say, after they voted not to rescind the circular letter, the governor had suspended the assembly. So this is really an act of resistance making this. And why is it the number 45? It's actually, you see more of this. It is because of this guy. Well, this magazine, John Wilkes. And here you can see John Wilkes. John Wilkes was, by his own account, the ugliest man in England. He was, however, he did say, and remember, this is a different time, he said he could seduce any woman if you gave him half an hour's head start. He had a certain charm about him, I guess. And he was a politician and a radical. He was a radical Whig. And he published a magazine called The North Briton. And here it is. And issue number 45 of The North Briton was suppressed by the British government because in it he attacked the crown, which you're not allowed to do. So that issue was suppressed. So if you are a true Whig, you will make the number 45 kind of your icon, which is why that punch bowl is made with 45 ounces of silver and contains 45 gills of rum. And you might even get a pin like this. See, 45 and Liberty, or these cufflinks, John Wilkes and Liberty. Wilkes and Liberty, this is actually a pipe cleaner. And here's a teapot with Wilkes on one side, Wilkes and Liberty, number 45 on the other. Other stuff, here's another punch bowl with John Wilkes on it. And the folks who are now gathering at the Liberty Tree in Boston also hang from it a red and white flag with red and white stripes. There are 5 red stripes, 4 white stripes. Anyone looking up would see 4 and 5 and know immediately what that meant. It's a tremendous iconography that they have with the number 45, which puts you on the side of the Whigs as opposed to the Tories. And in fact, Wilkes is a radical Whig. And in fact, he's expelled from Parliament, and then he gets reelected. And then he is charged with treason. He goes to France, comes back, and he is arrested, and he's held at a prison in the south part of London at St. George's Field. And sometime in 1768, so this is the same time you have all this tension in North Carolina, you have things happening in Boston, you have Wilkes at St. George's Field, and his supporters come to show how much they like him, and troops also come and fire into the crowd in what becomes known as the St. George's Field Massacre. And here you see the crowd being dispersed. This is another piece of the iconography, a boot. And this is because the king's tutor was a Scotsman named Lord Bute. And you see someone, and in fact, from the Liberty Tree, periodically there would be a boot that would have a green soul on it. Think about what it means to have a green soul. And there might be a devil coming out of the boot. And all of this is really clever iconography. And so St. George's Field has its massacre in 1768. And when you see things happening like the Regulators in North Carolina or increasing protests in Boston, what people have on their mind is this going to be an attempt to overthrow the government? One of the signs they saw at St. George's Field said something like, "No king, no taxes, no king." Well, George III certainly doesn't want people running around saying, "Hey, no king." Benjamin Franklin, by the way, who's in London during this time, said that if the king had had a bad moral character and Wilkes had had a good moral character, he probably could have overthrown the monarchy, as he has this popular enthusiasm behind him. There's another story about Wilkes. Someone telling Wilkes that if you were running against the devil, I would vote for the devil. And Wilkes said, well, then, if your friend is not a candidate, can I expect your vote? And there's another Wilkes story of, I think it was the Earl of Sandwich telling him, Wilkes, I don't know if you're going to die of a pox or on the gallows. And Wilkes says, well, that would depend if I were to embrace your mistress or your principles. He was not a shy person, I should say. And he likely could have, but you can see with these letters that people in Boston are writing to him, how they've connected with Wilkes. This is a letter from a group of worthy citizens in Boston writing to John Wilkes about his abilities and steady patriotism and so on. See, Benjamin Church and John Adams and Joseph Warren are all writing to John Wilkes. This is the Committee of the Boston Sons of Liberty are writing to this illustrious patriot, cheering him on. So Governor Bernard is really quite worried about what's happening here in Boston, which is why he calls for these troops, which arrived in October of 1768. Now, the troops get here, and there's really not a whole lot for them to do, because there isn't actually a rebellion going on here. And I mentioned last time the trouble of finding a place for the troops to stay and so on. Let me just so here is what happens in Boston. I'm sorry, I'm just bringing you through this. Yeah, we got a little ahead of ourselves. Okay, we do have call for a non-importation agreement. At Faneuil Hall, the town meeting gathers, and they say, and a merchants committee says, we're not going to import any of these goods that are taxed. And so they set up a boycott. And I don't know if any of you have ever participated in a boycott. It's very hard, actually. A boycott's a hard thing to carry off. And here they've said, we're not going to buy any lead, paint, glass, or tea. The lead you need to glaze for putting in windows, and glass you need to put in windows. And according to British law, you only could get lead and glass from Great Britain. We're not manufacturing it here. So if your window breaks, you're going to have to buy a new window. If your house needs painting, you're going to have to buy the paint from Great Britain. But now there's a boycott on these things. And remember, in 1765, Parliament had passed the stamp tax, people protested, and by 1766, Parliament backed down. This time, Parliament doesn't back down. So 1768, not buying stuff, 1769, not buying stuff, 1770, not buying stuff, and things just seem to get worse. And one thing that happens in the midst of all of this, when people see the boycott isn't effective, they start asking questions about it. And one guy who has particular questions is a merchant named Theophilus Lilly. And this is his shop here, the importer. And Lilly had signed the non-importation agreement. Then he says about a year into it, this really isn't working. Plus, I know who elected Parliament. And according to the theory, Parliament does have the power to govern. I don't know who elected these people who were enforcing the non-importation agreement. What I know is I was told to sign it. And is this really liberty? Being told by basically a pressure group that what I can and cannot sell. Is that liberty? And he also says, is it better to be governed by one tyrant 3,000 miles away or by 3,000 tyrants surrounding me? What do you think? Which is better? One tyrant, I mean, they're talking about tyranny, they're talking about liberty, but aren't they actually restricting his liberty? What do you think? Does he have a point? Or is he someone whose shop we should attack as they're doing here?
Guess it depends on your point of view.
Well, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. What's your point of view?
I don't know. That's that's a tough one.
Yeah. And I think the most maddening thing about this, if you are one of the Sons of Liberty, or if you are one of the Merchants Committee, or the Loyal Nine, is he is taking your argument and using it against you. And if you've ever been in a political discussion like this, and the other side sees through what you're doing and says, I agree with your argument, and this is exactly what you're doing, that is the most frustrating thing. Worse than if he said, yeah, the king should govern us in all cases whatsoever. No, he's saying, I believe in liberty too. But what about my liberty to sell whatever I want? Or the liberty of people who want to come to my shop to buy things? Yeah, I know who chose Parliament. I know who imposed this law, but I don't know who imposed this particular regulation. I mean, it's a mob, essentially, a group of merchants who decided something. And now they're enforcing it using this street action. Well, in February of 1770, Mr. Lilly announces that he has a cargo of goods he's going to be putting on sale on the 22nd of February, which happens to be a Thursday. Thursdays is a day off for the schoolboys of Boston. And on that Thursday, someone puts a big sign out of the shop with a finger saying, here is an importer. And that's a bad news because you're not supposed to be importing anything. We've decided not to buy all of this stuff. So a crowd of kids gathers in front of teenagers. We didn't have a concept of teenager then or adolescent, but one thing you should know is that as you get older, and I'm talking about just getting older from, say, 14 to 18, 18 to 21, you become more mature. I'm not casting judgment on people who aren't older now, but I'm just pointing this out as a fact. And things that you might do as a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old, you're likely not going to do as a 30-year-old. And so there's less restraint among these kids. Plus, there are members of the Sons of Liberty on the outskirts of the crowd encouraging them to discourage anyone from going into the shop. And they're discouraging people from going into the shop by throwing things at them. And also, they've smeared the front of the shop with pig dung and cow dung, which you can find readily in the streets of Boston. And if you are going into the shop, you're going to be pelted with pig dung or cow dung or other things. Good way of driving down business, actually. And on the outskirts of the crowd, there are members of the Sons of Liberty encouraging these kids. And this is before Twitter, other things, but word gets around. So more kids are gathering in front of Mr. Lilly's shop, which is on Hanover Street in the North End. Beyond it, you see the spire of the third church, or the second church, actually, the called Old North Church then, not to be confused with the Old North Church of today. And they're breaking the windows. Lilly and his wife and daughters are upstairs as this crowd of kids is attacking the house. And they hear kids coming over the back fence, trying to get into the backyard. And he has a friend who rents a room from him upstairs, Ebenezer Richardson. And Richardson was well known as an informer of at the customs house. He always seemed to know when someone was bringing in a cargo of goods that were supposed to be taxed and hadn't been. He was the reason in 1767 when John Hancock tried to bring in a cargo of Madeira wine, he tipped off the customs commissioners that there was actually Madeira wine on this vessel, that Hancock's store was empty. That's a long story. I'm sorry I didn't tell it to you. And what happens in this case is, as this crowd is growing, Richardson fires a gun out the window, a gun loaded with swan shot. These are small pellets. It hits a 12-year-old boy named Christopher Snyder, kills him, and actually kills him. Someone drags Richardson out of the house, and now the adults step in and they say, let's hang him from the lamppost. One of the Sons of Liberty on the outskirts of the crowd a guy named Molyneux says, no, don't hang him. Put him on trial, and then we can hang him legally. Because, think about this. This guy is fired into a crowd, killed this 12-year-old boy. Sider was just bending over to pick up a rock to throw through the window, and now the crowd wants to lynch Richardson for doing it. However, cooler heads prevail. Richardson is marched off to jail, where he is kept awaiting trial. And then as now, if you died, it would be up to your family to bury you. Sider, by the way, sometimes his name is spelled Snyder. No one's quite sure how his name is spelled. He's a kid from Germantown in Quincy. He's an apprentice in Boston. His parents are poor Germans in Germantown, and now he is dead. Well, his funeral is actually held from Faneuil Hall. A few days after his death, his body is carried out. Faneuil Hall is where the town meeting happens. This is the equivalent of City Hall. This is the seat of Boston's town meeting. Snyder's body is carried out of Faneuil Hall by 200 Boston school boys. And behind him march over 1,000 people. This is a kid, we don't even know how his name was spelled, but 1,000 people are turning out to mourn him. And here you see a poem written about him. The first martyr of the cause should bleed. I'm not even quite clear what the cause was in February of 1770. And I don't think that Sider was aware of what the cause was, other than, hey, let's throw rocks through this guy's window because people say it's a good idea. And the poem goes on, be Richardson forever banished here. The grand usurper is generally the devil. And then Snyder, behold, with what majestic love the illustrious retinue begins to move with secret rage. It's a tremendous poem. To see in thy corpse even majesty in death. This is written by Phyllis Wheatley, who is a young woman who had arrived in Boston just about a dozen years earlier. She was brought as a slave from West Africa, owned by the Wheatley family. She learned how to read and write, not only in English, but in Latin and Greek. And she had just published her first poem, or she would later that year, on the death of George Whitefield. But here is her poem on the death of Christopher Sider and this majestic love and the majesty he achieves in death. This is the largest public funeral held in North America up till this point. And this happens in January of 1770. February of 1770. Now, you can see the tension in Boston over this, and it may be something we appreciate more now than we might have at other times. This great tension, and at a moment's notice, you're going to have a mob turning out. And what happens next is this. On the 5th of March, actually on the 2nd of March, well, there are these troops in Boston, as I've mentioned, 2 regiments of troops. And there had been, the initial, where are they going to stay? And now they've essentially been doing garrison duty. They are, and some of them don't have a lot to do. They're not very well paid. Some of them actually strike up relationships with young women in Boston. I mean, the town is small, and if you're a young woman in Boston, here you suddenly have these, 4,000 British soldiers who might make more eligible companions than the kind of guys you typically see in Boston. So we know of a number of marriages between soldiers and local women, and other kinds of relationships between the soldiers. Many of them are renting rooms around town. There are a couple of warehouses that have been leased as barracks. But these guys are also looking for work. Well, on Friday morning, the 2nd of March, one of these soldiers is walking past a rope works in the South End, somewhere along what is now Congress Street. A group of rope workers are standing there. Being a rope worker was you didn't need any skill to be a rope worker. It was tough work, it was manual labor, and often this was for guys who had washed out as sailors or doing anything else. And by the way, being a sailor at this time wasn't even a rung on the economic ladder. Samuel Johnson, the great British man of letters, said that the only men who go to sea or those who cannot contrive to get themselves into prison. Going to sea is like going to prison with the added possibility of drowning. So you couldn't do that. You become a rope worker. So these rope workers are standing around outside the rope works. The soldier walks by, and one of the rope workers says, "Hey, are you looking for a job?" He says, "Sure, I could use a job." And the rope worker says, "Well, you can clean the shit house." And the other rope workers think this is pretty funny, as this soldier in his fancy uniform cleaning the outhouse, and the soldier knows he has been insulted, and so he punches the guy, overlooking the fact the guy is surrounded by a dozen of his friends who proceed to pummel this soldier. And the soldier gets away, goes back to the barracks, comes back with about a dozen soldiers, and the soldiers and the rope workers go at it again. And who do you suppose wins this fight between rope workers and soldiers? I should have had a poll for you.
Soldiers?
Well, why would you say the soldiers?
They're trained in like combat and stuff.
No, they're trained to fire weapons. They're not trained in having a street brawl, which these guys know how to conduct a street brawl. These guys pummel the soldiers.
Are the soldiers armed? Or?
Excuse me, Eric?
Are the soldiers armed?
Well, no, they didn't come with their arms. They just came. Okay, so that's certainly a difference. I mean, they might have brought on clubs or things. However, what happens next is you see all...
12 soldiers thought it was a good idea to take on dock workers?
Yeah, they were mad. There's another rope works. There are a couple of guys sitting there playing cards, and a couple of soldiers come in and jump them, thinking, okay, the rope workers really hate us. Rope workers are really tough guys, okay? And so you're having these brawls between soldiers and rope workers all weekend. And so some of the British officers, the ones with sense, tell the soldiers, stay off the streets, don't wear your uniforms out in public. And some townspeople start carrying weapons too, thinking, okay, we're going to get even with these guys. Monday morning, someone posted a notice around town saying, citizens of Boston, stay off the streets if you know what's good for you. When it was signed, soldiers of His Majesty's 29th Regiment. It's doubtful the soldiers had gone out and printed this up. But this notice is something you as a citizen of Boston are going to say, these people think they are telling us to stay off the streets. And by the way, also Saturday night, a British sergeant disappeared. And so Colonel Goldfinch had the rope works searched. Now, John Gray, who owned the rope works, is furious when he finds out British soldiers have gone into his rope works and searched it. He calls in Colonel Goldfinch, said, why did you search my rope works? And he said, well, one of my sergeants disappeared. I thought maybe the rope workers had killed him. Well, why would he have killed him? And he tells Mr. Gray about the fight. And this is the first time Gray says he's heard about it. He says, I'm going to fire that guy on Monday, but don't raid the rope works anymore. By the way, the British sergeant actually had spent the night in a brothel on what is now North Street, not killed by the rope workers. But you see there's fighting going on between soldiers and rope workers. And then Monday morning, this flyer posted around town. And then Monday night at about 7 p.m., a crowd gathers in front of Faneuil Hall in Dock Square. And they're harangued by a guy wearing a white wig and a red cape to go and attack the British barracks on Brattle Square. This is a sugar warehouse at Brattle Square. And so the crowd, and by the way, people remember the sound of the stock pens in Faneuil Hall being pulled apart so people could get weapons to go and attack this barracks. They march up the hill. The barracks is roughly where the government center T station stands now. And they attack this barracks, and the soldiers are standing outside. There is a fence, so the townspeople can't get through the fence. Colonel Goldfinch comes on the scene, tells the soldiers just go back inside because they're going to lose interest in throwing things at a building, which turns out to be true. And the crowd does is, imagine this, these are people attacking a British barracks. And they decide to go look for trouble elsewhere. And if you were up this street, there is a small alleyway. They start coming through this alleyway. And down here in front of the customs house, there was one sentry, Private U. White, was standing guard in front of the customs house. And a group of apprentices see him. Here's one British soldier. And they start yelling things. Well, actually not yelling. They're very close to him, and they're yelling things at him, like, you bloody lobster back. who buys lobster, doing other things to insult him. And Private White is trying to get these kids away from him. And a magistrate comes on the scene, a guy whose job it is to patrol the streets at night and tell people who are out past curfew they should go home. And Private White says to the magistrate, why don't you tell these kids to go home? The magistrate's a guy in his 70s. He doesn't want to tell this group of unruly kids to go home. They might turn on him. You might find yourself in the same situation one day. And he says, don't worry, to Private White, they're only boys. And now the boys have seen a magistrate came on the scene, wouldn't do anything about this. And White is trying to keep the kids away. More kids come on the scene, and White pushes one of the boys with his gun. The boy falls to the ground just as this crowd comes around the alley, and what they see is a British soldier knocking this boy to the ground. So now they go and surround Private White, and they're yelling at Private White. They're throwing things at Private White, and this sound brings more people into the street. Someone goes into the first church here and starts ringing the bell. So more people gather out, come here into King Street. The bell means there's a fire. So you're going to come out into the street wanting to know, where is the fire? Where is the fire? You have to go out so you can put the fire out. Here they see a crowd. Maybe this is where the fire is. So more people are pressing around Private White. Someone goes up here. There's a barracks here where some British soldiers are living. And Captain Thomas Preston is the captain of the guard that night. He gets 7 men, and the idea is we'll go to the custom house, pick up Private White, go back to the barracks. We're all getting off of the street. So Captain Preston gets his men to the front of the, by the way, I'm showing you this is actually, this one on the right is actually the crime scene. Let me see if I can shrink mine so we can see it. So this is the barracks. This, you can see these, what look like lollipops. These are the soldiers. This is the townhouse, the old state house. Up here, about a block, is the alley. They'd come around here. Another officer lives here. This is another importer here. So they had knocked the windows out of this place on their way by. But now you have the townspeople surrounding the soldiers and throwing things at them. You really see a big difference between this scene, this crime scene, which tries to, done for the court, which tries to give an accurate depiction of what happened. These are the victims. And this image, which is probably the most famous image of the American Revolution. Look at where the soldiers are here in contrast to where they are here. You know, how close they are. This is the custom house. According to this, they're crowded around the front of it. According to this, they're in the middle of the street. And here you see the townspeople are crowded around the building on the other side of the street. The soldiers have really usurped the middle of the street. And this is really an extraordinarily clever piece of propaganda that was first done by Henry Pelham. This is Henry Pelham's drawing of it. And Pelham puts, this is the townhouse. This is the seat of the provincial government. And here is the first church. This is the ecclesiastical authority here. But what you see here in the street are these armed men seizing power. And he calls it the fruits of arbitrary power, or the bloody massacre. And he wants to print more copies of this. This is a print he has, and he's printing to sell. And he takes his engraving to Paul Revere, wanting Revere also to make copies and then sell them. But you see Revere, one thing Revere does that is quite clever is puts engraved, printed, and sold by Paul Revere at the bottom. He copyrights it essentially, and it really wasn't his drawing. But this is the way we're going to remember this event. And you see the difference between that event, that depiction of it, and this one. Now, the interesting thing here is that Paul Revere did both of these drawings. He did this engraving on the left, and he did the crime scene, where he shows where the victims were. And the other, we don't have the key to this any longer, but these other numbers indicate people who were injured. So Gray and Addicks are in front. This is Samuel Maverick and Benjamin Caldwell. So you can see the victims, you can see the wounded, and you also can get a sense of how big this crowd must have been surrounding them. And also, this is a fairly genteel crowd in this drawing. This really was a group of longshoremen, sailors. Crispus Attucks was coming down Corn Hill carrying a couple of clubs. One of the witnesses at the trial said he handed one to me and said, "Let's go get them." And Attucks pushed his way to the front of the crowd. And he was in the process of grabbing Private Montgomery's gun, just as here's what happened. According to British law, the soldiers could not fire on the crowd until a magistrate had come on the scene and read the Riot Act, declaring that this is an illegal gathering. Once the magistrate has read the Riot Act, the crowd has an hour to disperse. If they haven't dispersed in an hour, then the soldiers can fire. The soldiers know this, the crowd knows this. There's really nothing these guys can do, even though they have weapons. And the crowd is yelling, "Why don't you fire? You don't dare fire. You don't dare fire because you're a coward." And meanwhile, the church bells are ringing and people are coming into the street yelling, "Where is the fire?" So we're yelling, "You don't dare fire." As I said, Attucks is grabbing Montgomery's gun. A block of wood sails through the air, hits Private Montgomery in the side of the head. He stumbles, he gets up and says, "God damn you, I will fire." By the way, that's something he only announces publicly after he is safely on a boat out of Boston. So Montgomery does fire, and the soldier next to him also fires. Captain Preston yells, "Why did you fire?" Some of the other soldiers think, well, now he's given the order to fire, and they fire. And by this time, 5 people have been wounded mortally. About 6 others have been very seriously wounded. And this has the effect of quieting things down, actually, because no one was expecting the soldiers to fire. And Preston is able to get the men back into the barracks. Governor Thomas Hutchinson comes on the scene and hears witnesses for the rest of the night. Hutchinson goes out onto the balcony of the old State House, telling people, "Go to your homes." He says, "The law will take its course. I will live and die by the law." Early the next morning, Hutchinson has Captain Preston and the 8 soldiers arrested for murder. And so they are taken to jail. So this is what the Bostonians will call the horrid massacre. You saw Paul Revere's engraving and Henry Pelham's engraving of the scene. And the town of Boston writes its own report on this, using the 80 some odd people who testified as witnesses, saying that the soldiers had fired into an unarmed crowd without provocation. And Adams wants all of the soldiers removed from Boston. Hutchinson doesn't think he has the power to remove them. The town meeting in Boston demands the soldiers' removal, and Hutchinson ultimately, reluctantly, has the soldiers sent off to Castle Island. Now, I could keep going, but I know we're out of time. So I will we'll call it a night. And are there any questions before we? Okay, that's essentially what happened on the 5th of March, which Boston is going to turn into a day to remember in a certain way. But as you should get from looking at the different depictions, it was really a memory that was being shaped for political purposes. Okay, so I will see you all on Wednesday.
See you, Professor.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.